What is up, everyone? Welcome to the stream. My name is Chris. Some of you might know me already from streaming in tandem with Nick and Tony. So, for those of you who don't know me yet, well, as I said, my name's Chris. I'm a product specialist for Yamaha Canada, so I'm the Canadian counterpart to Nick and Tony. And today will be my first solo stream with you guys. And we'll be looking at some tips and tricks that I've come across over the years by using Helix, and we'll explore some of them together. And I hope that you will learn something today and at least show you some different ways of using secret and way features in Helix that maybe you don't, well, maybe I don't think of sometimes, right? So that's what we're going to be going over today. First of all, I notice already that we have questions in the comments. So there's Raphael who was saying that he got a Catalyst 200 to pair with his Helix floor, and their goal was to use the amps and effects of the Catalyst to free DSP on the Helix. Then they've noticed, per the next comment here, that the Catalyst doesn't react the same way with receiving the signal from Helix as opposed to using Helix with, let's say, an FR cab or something. I would say, and then Raphael asks for any tips and tricks, maybe. I would say maybe consider lowering the gain on the amp itself first, using maybe a cleaner amp model, just to make sure that the preamp section of the Catalyst doesn't overdrive your effects. That would be a good start. And if that works, well, you could always then explore gain settings and maybe just add overdrives on the Helix itself to stack gain, as opposed to using higher gain settings on the amp itself. Or you could always just try the send return of the Catalyst. Then you might need to use amp models on your Helix, but at least you won't have to use the cabs, and it'll be a much cleaner signal because the return of the Catalyst will bypass the preamp section of the amp. So I hope that answers most of your questions, and feel free to let me know if any of this works. So we'll start today with one first trick here. Let me just switch to my HX Edit window. The first trick is something that I've talked about with Nick and Tony in previous streams, which is pretty obvious, but some of us maybe are very recently acquainted with this feature, and it's the high and low cut features of the cab block. So if you were to scroll down here, you will see that there's a low and high cut on each speaker. So by default, they're set fairly high depending on the speaker and mic model themselves. Let's just add, and this cab is already set to my liking, so let's just create a new one and see what we get. So I'm going to add something classic, just a 212 G25 here. Let's just hear how that sounds as is. So fairly balanced. The high cut is at 8 kilohertz, which is not that low of a cut, but still it already tames a lot of the highs compared to as if it was way higher than like this. So now we can hear a lot more fizz, and if I were to turn it way down, like let's say 3 kilohertz, you will hear that it's way darker after that. So let's try it. So as we can hear, it takes a lot of the high end off, and that obviously is a bit too much of a cut. But for example, this speaker emulation is based on a classic green speaker, and its natural high cut point for this specific one would be around 7K. So feel free to play around those values to get closer to the real thing as possible, as close to the real thing. So let's put it around 7 here, and it'll be fairly natural sounding, not too bright, not too dark. So nice feature from the cap block, super useful, especially if you're going live. If you're recording, you can always adjust it post-production, but if you're live and you want to sound as close as possible to the real thing, that's something you gotta use. It's going to tame a lot of the harshness that it's sometimes linked to those high-end modelers like Helix, for example. So that's a way of sounding really the closest to the real thing. Then another trick, if you still find that your sound is a bit bright to your liking, would be going to the input section and adjusting the impedance. So what this does is basically it changes the values in the input section of the Helix, and it will make you sound brighter or darker depending on the setting. By default, it's going to be set to auto, which is pretty much the brightest setting. Depending on the pickups that you're going to use, it might change values by itself because it's in automatic mode, but it's pretty much always going to sound like this at 1 mega ohm. So it's going to sound exactly like it just sounded when we were playing. So let's hear it. If I were to go to the lowest value here, which is 10K, it's going to be way darker. So obviously this is way too dark. So the trick is really to play around with those values to see which one you like the most. Most people will leave it at auto, and that's perfectly fine. But let's say if you have a really bright sounding guitar, it might be a feature that you want to play with. So let's just go back to 1 mega ohm and go down the values to see what is something that is a bit less bright but not dark in itself. So that's starting to get a bit dark to my taste. Let's try again with 230. And then back to 1 mega ohm. One last time back to 230. So for my specific guitar, my Revstar here, it's got really bright pickups and it's Alnico 5, so tighter by default. So this is a setting where I feel most comfortable. And then, as I said, feel free to play with the values depending on your guitar. It's going to drastically affect the sound. So that would be it for that kind of high cut in a way too. So there's two ways of really playing with the highs in your signal, and those are both really effective ways. So got some comments here from Pixelot. Thanks for mentioning the high cut. Well, it's such a useful feature that I really try to always mention it, because it's sometimes overlooked, because it's you gotta scroll down on the cab section, so you don't always know that it's there. But it's such a useful feature because it really allows you to sound like an actual guitar speaker, because guitar speakers are not full range like the Helix is, for example. So it's not made to receive such a signal. So by dialing it that way, you get closer to the real thing. So thanks, Pixelot. Let's go over to another trick. Sometimes if you get guitars with really high output pickups, you might find that the input section of the Helix gets kind of muddy sounding. It'll be most obvious with higher gain amps. So like with this one here, it was a fairly clean signal, so you wouldn't notice it as much, but yeah, it's going to stick together. But if we were to switch to a high gain amp, I'm going to remove that here, it's going to get fairly muddy real quick. So two ways to deal with that. First is going back to the input section again and turning the pad on. So by default, it's going to be set to global. So if you haven't played with that function in your global settings, it's going to be off by default. For those of you who have played with that section of the settings, you might have turned it on. So depending on your global setting, it might be on or off depending. But for me, my global settings were untouched, so it was off by default. So if we turn it off again, just to hear a quick sample, and then I'll turn it on to see the difference. Then on. So it removed quite a bit of gain from the input section, not from the amp. So the signal gets a bit cleaner, and it makes it easier to hear palm mutes. And if you were to do faster kind of picking patterns, it would add some definition, or at least retain some definition in the signal, so you don't lose everything if you got too much gain. So that's a way to do it. Then if you don't want to sound as clean, there's another trick here, which is to use a EQ block at the very beginning of your signal chain, and that's by using the low high shelf EQ block. And I leave most values at their default settings, so the last four here I don't really play with, and then I just control the amount of low that I want to cut from the signal. So if so at minus 0.06, it's not going to make that much of a difference, so I'm going to put a more drastic cut so we can really hear the difference. Let's just turn it off and play, and then I'll turn it on and we'll hear the difference. And then on. And off again. So as you can hear, the signal got way brighter because we removed some of those low mids. Usually around 250 to 300 hertz is where the mud is. So that's why I leave the value at 300 hertz, because that's the only part that I want to remove from the signal in itself. A way to dealing with the loss in the low mid department would be to add another block of the same type, so another low I shelf here after the amp, because then the preamp takes care of your signal, so the change is not going to be as drastic. So if I cut minus 4.3 here, I'm going to want to add about 2.5 to 3 decibels to compensate. Then let's just hear with the first cut, but without adding anything back. So no mud, but it got a bit thin to my liking, especially if you play with higher gain amps. You really want that stadium quality in your sound. You want it to sound big. So let's just add the other low I shelf after the amp. So I'm just going to play before, and then we'll turn it on. And then let's turn it on here. And then we'll assign both of those to the same foot switch so we can hear the before and after for those two additions to the signal. So now they are both off. Yep. Okay. Now they're both off, so let's hear the amp as is. And let's add both of them. So we still retained a bit of tightness in a way. The mud is still mostly gone, but you regained the bass that you lost by adding the first EQ block in the single chain. So it's really a good way to tame some of the mud but not color your tone by adding the second EQ block back after the amp. So that's a way of dealing with frequency loss in that case. Then we're going to switch to another trick here, which is my favorite one by far. So let's just get rid of those. Okay, that's back. So let's say you got a higher gain kind of sound and you just switch from a clean preset. So let's just hear that Elmsley again. Switch to solo lead here. So in my opinion, this preset in comparison to the other preset sounds really scooped and not as usable if you were to use the two together to switch from a clean sound to a dirty sound. And you could spend tons of time trying to dial in cabs and add EQ blocks and try all sorts of things to make it sound closer in terms of frequencies, because the cleaner sound was way more mid-forward and kind of present, and this one is way more bassy and scooped. So a quick trick to solve that issue is to add a kinky block between your amp and cab, and it's fairly easy to set. You just set the drive all the way off, your boost on, and to your liking you can set the bright on, which is something I'm going to do, and it's going to transform your preset, and it took 15 seconds to dial in maybe. So let's just hear it without. Really sizzling, but muddy and kind of scooped. But if we add the kinky boost here, and So now we're in a sonic territory that's way closer to the cleaner preset that we had dialed in. So if I just save it here and we compare, it's going to make it way more usable if you were to use the two together. So let's just switch back to the Elmsley here. Go back to the solo lead with the addition of the kinky. So now instead of being super scooped and way too different to my liking to the first cleaner preset, it pairs well with the other preset. So it's less of a bigger transition between clean and dirty, and it makes it so you can pair higher gain amps really well instead of having all kinds of amps just to get your cleans, crunch, and high gains. So that's a really good way to dial in an amp quickly, especially if you're on the go and you've got to make a preset real quick. That's a sure way to get things going, and maybe it just shifts the frequencies in a way that you like, so it could be applied to existing presets as well. It's a matter of preference, really. Then if we look at other sections, we can keep the idea here of the low high shelf cut and add it with fuzzes to remove some of the mud too, to make them sound like overdrives and not as fuzzy and muddy as maybe some of you would. Let's just go to another preset here. So I'm going to be using the newer Dark Dove Fuzz here, and we'll add the EQ block to cut some of the mud, because as you hear, it's going to get real muddy real quick. So that's way too muddy to my taste. I know that the gain is high, but with those fuzzes, if you get it too low, you don't get the right feel. And then if you get them too high, you gain too much mud. So that's almost a lose-lose in a way, with not as much gain. Then let's put somewhere in the middle. Let's add that same EQ block to cut some of the mud, and we'll see quite the difference. So as you can hear, it almost transform your fuzz into an overdrive. It becomes way cleaner. You hear the transient of your pick attack, so it makes it more usable in my case, because I don't want the all-out kind of broken sounding fuzz. I just want more gain than an overdrive, but still retain that pick attack. So that's a real good way to keep that pick attack, as I said, in your signal with all the goodness of a fuzz. So we got another question here, I think, from Music Minute. He's using the Stomp XL as their main pedal board. Is there any advice on input impedance in that first, or enabled in the menu? There's a setting for the input impedance in your global settings, but if you switch guitars often, I would suggest adjusting that setting per preset, because if you make presets for a certain guitar, you might not like the same amount, well, the same impedance as some other presets or some other guitars. So I would really suggest adjusting that setting per preset. So if you end up switching to a different instrument, it'll be always to your liking in that way. Thanks for the question. So now, one last thing, since we're using a fuzz here, another way to keeping that pick attack, that transient that I was talking about, would be to create a clean blend with the rest of your signal here. So a way to do so is to split your chain as I did just here. So by dragging your fuzz to the second line here, it's going to create a split, and then you're gonna want to change the parameter of your split to split A-B, and then we'll hear how it sounds like. The volume might go up. I'm just going to adjust it in the mixer here first, so we don't get quite the jump. That's part of the blend, and that's so for now it doesn't make that much of a difference, but the way to adjust your clean blend is to route here, is to change that value. If you route it to B, it's going to increase the amount of fuzz in this signal, and if you route it towards A, it's going to decrease the amount of fuzz in your signal. You never really want to get past 80 on either way, because then it's going to either become too clean or too distorted. So I'll give you an example at, let's say, 50, and then I'll go to 100 so you can hear the difference. That was at 50, then 0, and then I'll do 100. So too muddy. Too clean, and then way too clean. Then let's just find a happy medium. Let's say 65. That's still a bit clean to my taste. Let's go to 50. That's a way of keeping the very high gain part of the fuzz, but retaining a lot of your pick attack and frequencies too, because sometimes you don't get too many adjustments EQ wise on your fuzz, and a lot of them will sound very scooped. So creating a clean blend like that will allow you to retain the original frequencies of your amp, and then blending in some parts of that fuzz. So you will retain more mids if that's what you want to do. And then, as I mentioned, you will also keep that pick attack, so you get definition when on whatever you're playing. Really, if you need to do palm mutes or just a bit more picking than just big chords, then that's a good way to keep that in your signal. So let's just hear again without the blend, and I'll add it again. Let's add the blend. So as you can hear, it almost becomes an overdrive, but you get the really sizzling sound that is associated with fuzzes. So that's also a good way to modify in a way the existing blocks in a way that's more suited for you. So that is pretty much it for the tips and tricks for today. Thank you to everyone who asked questions. I hope that at least someone here learned something new today, and that new thing is going to make you experience different kind of sounds and change your approach on how you dial in presets. That's the real goal. So thank you everyone for watching, and we'll see you in the next one. Take care.